And once again, I'd like to welcome everyone to the Los Angeles Birders webinar for April 18th. We have a great program in store tonight, and to introduce our speaker, I would like to I'd like to introduce Desi Seabirds to introduce our speaker for tonight. Desi.
Thanks, Ron. Tonight, we have the pleasure to welcome Dr. Myra Finkelstein. Myra is a native Californian and received her undergraduate degree from UC Davis. Before returning to graduate school, she volunteered with several nonprofit organizations working on conservation issues, mostly marine conservation. But she says she always felt a bit limited because she didn't have a good understanding of effective solutions. So Myra took a graduate course at UC Santa Cruz, studying aquatic chemistry and physical oceanography. She also started volunteering in a lab that measured contaminants such as organic chlorines and trace metals. Myra earned her Ph.D. in environmental toxicology, and today she is an adjunct professor in the microbiology and environmental toxicology department at UC Santa Cruz, where she lives with her young family. Myra's research focuses on human impacts to wildlife with an emphasis on contaminant-induced effects. Dr. Finkelstein and her team at the UC Santa Cruz were the first to definitively link lead ammunition to the lead poisoning impeding the recovery of free-flying California condor populations. Myra is currently studying plastic contaminants and how many species are negatively affected by plastic ingestion. Tonight, she'll give us an overview of how avian species are exposed and harmed by plastic, with a special focus on seabirds, who are particularly vulnerable to plastic pollution, which poses a threat to their very survival, but also has far-reaching effects on marine ecosystems. So please welcome Dr. Myra Finkelstein.
Thank you, Desi. I don't know where you picked up some of that. Okay, let me share screen.
Okay.
Okay. Work? Okay.
It's getting there. Give it there you go. Okay, we're up and running.
Okay, perfect. Okay, thank you. I'm just going to get started. So today I have a little bit of an overview. I'm going to first start with an introduction about plastic, then discuss plastic as an endocrine disruptor, and then I'll talk about some of my current research, looking at the biological effects of plastic on seabirds, focusing on macroplastic, in particular a study involving an in vitro model for northern fulmars, and microplastic, looking at common murres in the Monterey Bay. I'm just going to end with a couple of slides about what do we do. This is such a huge problem, and what can we do about it as individual citizens? So plastic, it's a 3D porous polymer structure. It's manufactured with additives like phthalates, flame retardants, biocides, stuff like that. And it's like if you go to the store and you buy something such as a baby bottle, you can have over 100 chemicals in just that one plastic item. And it can be very difficult to understand which chemicals are actually inside the plastic, but there can be a lot. And it's a global problem. This is a slide from Indonesia, and it's just, I'm sure everybody has seen these pictures, and plastic pollution is accumulating across the globe. And some of these slides that I'm going to talk to you or show you, some of these pictures like the one I just showed you, and then some of the facts that I'm pulling talking about plastics is from this documentary called A Story of Plastic. And if you're interested in this, I really recommend that you watch this documentary. It's a really very good in-depth summary of the entire problem and a story behind how did we get to where we are with plastic. But I'm going to talk a little bit about how we got to where we are as well. So in the late 1800s, plastic was initially invented to replace ivory. John Wesley Hyatt invented the first synthetic plastic it was a celluloid. It was actually made from cotton fiber while searching for a replacement for ivory. It's actually kind of a good thing. And then in the early 1900s, Leo Baekeland produced Bakelite, which was this malleable, heat-resistant, non-conductive material. And it was cheaper than celluloid at the time although he didn't really think of the environmental costs because this is what's first derived from fossil fuels. And then comes along World War II, and that's when really plastic production just kind of skyrocketed. You know, it was very effective and very important for the war effort, for parachutes, nylon for parachutes, and plexiglass for warplanes. Very, very important, and a lot of plastic things became made. And since then, we've just sort of taken off, and it's everywhere. It's convenient, it's cheap. I don't know why it's so cheap, but it's cheap. And it's resourceful. You can do all kinds of things with it. And I just want to take 20 seconds and have you look around your house, yourself, where you're sitting, and identify all the things that you have around you that has some plastic component in it. Because I can assure you it's probably more than half a dozen. I mean, I can see here pens, computers, you know, computer stand. Plastic is basically infiltrated our lives. And today, about 99% of what goes into plastic is derived from fossil fuels. And I bring this up because when we talk about climate change and we talk about reducing fossil fuels, it's important to understand that plastic is another component of that. And if you think about, you know, your takeout fork, that was initially a fossil fuel waste product. So it's kind of not a good thing all around. It is a global problem. Plastic production is growing exponentially. And like on the flip side of that, then plastic, you know, pollution is also growing exponentially. There's estimates that 8 million tons per year of plastic enter the ocean. There are predictions that by 2050 that there will be more plastic than fish by weight in the ocean. It's just taking off and doesn't seem to be slowing down. COVID was not a good thing for reduction of plastic. And in addition to all the takeout forks and spoons and things that we used, over 1.5 million face masks were estimated to enter the ocean in 2020 alone. So what about recycling? I'm a recycling nut. I mean, just ask my husband. I try to recycle everything. I'm constantly pulling things out of the garbage. Like, you can recycle this. But it's not really the solution. This is a New York Times article that says the greatest trick corporations ever played was making us think we could recycle their products. And then from the story of plastic, they talk a lot about this. And basically, the fate of plastic, and only 2% they've estimated are effectively recycled. Although I am a recycling nut, so though I do still encourage people to recycle when they can. I do think it's better than nothing, but it's not going to get us out of this mess. Recycling is not the answer. So depending on the size, plastic can cause harm through entanglement, ingestion, or even inhalation. You can think of megaplastic, those big items like your big water bottle, and that can then be broken down or breaking into pieces of macroplastic, or like a bottle cap could be macroplastic. That can even break down further into microplastic, which is defined as something less than 5 millimeters in size. So for entanglement for plastic, it can directly kill birds and animals by entanglement. It can cause suffocation, perforation of the GI tract. And I'm just going to segue into a little story here. So I did my Ph.D. work on Midway Atoll, and Midway is full of these adorable Laysan albatross chicks, just like this, that are basically all around where we stay. So I was walking to like the Fish and Wildlife office one day, and I passed by this Laysan albatross chick, and it was trying to regurgitate something. And it was like kind of trying to regurgitate it up. And so I walked over to it, him or her, and I was sort of trying to figure out, and I could see this like green plastic thing coming up and then going back down again. And then it came up and then it went back down. And then I'm like, not sure what to do, right? is there another biologist around, or what do I do? And I'm not sure. And then it came up again, a little bit more coming out, and I grabbed it. And then I really didn't know what to do, because do I pull it out, and do I risk like what's on the other side? And is it like inside? Am I going to like rip out this bird's digestive tract right here? And I'm just, I didn't go to vet school for a reason, right? And so I didn't know, but I had it then. I wasn't going to let it go. So I gently kind of massage it out of the bird, and it turns out to be this long green tooth. But I got it. It didn't have any digestive material attached to it, so the bird was fine. They're very hardy, but it's crazy how much is out there. So besides this kind of direct entanglement or some kind of suffocation or things, that's kind of ingestion, they can also have it through ingestion and inhalation. So macroplastic can block the digestive tract, so that toothbrush could have gotten in there and caused problems and blocked it, and can inhibit nutrient uptake. And then microplastic, there's been studies that have shown it can cause cellular damage and inflammation sort of site. So either in the lining of the gastrointestinal tract or in the lungs where it is. And these are pictures here of birds that have basically carcasses that are full of plastic, which you see all over Midway. So plastic also can cause, besides just the item directly killing the bird or killing the animal, it can cause exposure to these harmful chemicals that the plastic is made of. And this can cause sublethal effects. So for the next few slides, I'm going to talk about this. So most of these chemicals that compose the plastic matrix are endocrine disrupting chemicals. So they disrupt hormone function. So how does that specifically work? So if you think about, we have a cell, and so the E is basically your endogenous estrogen, which people have, animals have. And XE is a xenoestrogen, or some kind of a compound that looks like estrogen but isn't estrogen. And so these are what a lot of plastic chemicals are. They look like estrogen and they behave like estrogen, but they're not estrogen. What happens is they can enter the cell, they can bind with the estrogen receptor, and then they can create a response. But you can see here that that's not a very good thing. Is if you have a chemical that looks and mimics a hormone binding to a receptor and then creating a response that's inappropriate because it wasn't responding to the hormone. And so many, again, of these chemicals in plastic are endocrine disrupting. They can look like estrogen, so they call them xenoestrogens, and it can cause increased risk of cancer, feminization in males, reproductive abnormalities, and all kinds of endocrine dysregulation, obesity. A lot of these are also called obesogens, many other negative effects. So you can think of how important hormone regulation is. So these chemicals just disrupt that. So don't we ban some of these chemicals that are really bad endocrine disruptors? But the problem is industry has gotten very good at replacing one harmful chemical with another. So one plastic-associated endocrine disrupting chemical that's gotten a lot of publicity is BPA, bisphenol A. And you must have heard about it. So now we have like BPA-free, plastic, BPA water bottles, BPA-free, for your bottles for your kids. But unfortunately, what industry's done is they've replaced it with something called BPS, which appears to have similar toxicity to BPA. And the amount of research and work that has to go into before something like is taken or they switch out a compound is a lot. So now we're just like starting again with BPS. And this is called basically a regrettable substitution, where industry basically just changes out with like minor chemical change, but it still has the same toxic effect. And this is an opinion from the Washington Post saying, stop playing whack-a-mole with toxic chemicals. It's a good article if you would read it. I have the link. So my current graduate student actually did some work looking at the binding affinity of BPA, which is the one that's now been prohibited to be used in lots of products, especially products for infants and toddlers, with BPS. And Elizabeth Van Hassel, my current graduate student, looked at the binding affinity, basically how well these compounds will bind to an estrogen receptor compared to estradiol, which is basically just endogenous estrogen. And on the y-axis is the max E2 response, and black is estradiol, red is BPA, and you can see here the blue is BPS. So BPS is worse using this test in terms of its ability to bind to the estrogen receptor and elicit a response. And that's what got switched out for a lot of things. So that's a problem. So this is a talk about seabirds. So we're going to now kind of switch gears a little bit and talk about then seabirds and plastic. So all of these things I'm talking about, like this endocrine disrupting capacity, this is not unique to seabirds or humans or other avian species or mammal species. Like we all have these estrogen receptors. We all have this problem with plastic. A lot of work though has been done on birds, and I'm going to focus the rest of the talk on. So one of my colleagues actually published this paper, The Threat of Plastic Pollution to Seabirds is Global, Pervasive, and Increasing. And in it, they basically say that we predict that plastic ingestion is increasing in seabirds, that it will reach 99% of all seabird species will have been documented to ingest plastic by 2050, that effective waste management can actually reduce the threat. So how does macroplastic get into seabirds? Well, you basically have plastic disposal in the ocean, and then you can get accumulation at these convergent zones. But other things that accumulate at these convergent zones are really good things for seabirds and other migratory animals to eat, like fish eggs, things like that. So seabirds will zero in on these convergent zones, pick up plastic, and sometimes maybe fish eggs are attached to the plastic, ingest them, and feed them to their chicks. This here is a picture of basically tens of thousands of plastic lighters that were collected on Midway Atoll. And here's another carcass of a Laysan albatross chick that's just full of these lighters. And when I was on Midway, every albatross chick I examined had ingested plastic. So every carcass that I looked at had signs of plastic, like had pieces of plastic, either big pieces or little pieces, sharp pieces. I found syringes, G.I. Joe dolls, crazy. But also birds, seabirds, when they get to be old enough, the seabird chicks, they will regurgitate the non-digestible material, and they'll regurgitate a bolus. And they all have pretty synchronistic breeding. So about the same time of the year, all the albatross chicks are regurgitating these boluses. So you can walk around and look at boluses from tens of thousands of albatross chicks. And granted, I haven't looked at tens of thousand boluses, but every single bolus that I looked at had plastic in it. Fishing line, plastic fishing line, again, plastic pieces, bottle caps, you name it, it had it. Every single one. Down pat. It's such a huge problem. In fact, when I was doing my PhD work on Midway, I wasn't studying plastic, but it is such a huge impact on you when you're out there that you can't not think about what can I do about this, or how can I help this problem? It's just, it is mind-blowing how bad it is. And there is a lot of data on these on macroplastic ingestion in seabird species. Sort of like the carcasses I showed you, a group that I work with, Aquinos Ecosystem Knowledge, they have a program where they necropsy bycatch seabirds and they quantify the amount of plastic in them. And these are some of their data. On the y-axis, percent plastic incidence, they looked at 246 lace-in albatross, 373 black-footed albatross. They had between like 50 to 65% of them had plastic in their digestive tracts when they died. And there's a lot of papers looking at this, you know, basically examining either dead birds or boluses from live birds and quantifying how much plastic. But there's very, very little information on what is it, like, how is it harming them? I mean, why should we care? I mean, you would think it's not a good thing if every single albatross had, you know, chick had plastic in it, but how is that actually preventing that bird from surviving or from reproducing? What could be the population level impact? And so for the rest of the talk, I'm just going to talk about some of the current research that we're doing in my lab. One about my current graduate student, Lisbeth, who I showed you her graph earlier, looking at macroplastic in northern fulmars. And another one, a recently published study by a recently graduated master's student, Sammy, who looked at microplastic in common murres in the Monterey Bay. And the goal again is to try to quantify the prevalence and understand the biological impact. So for Lisbeth's work, macroplastic in northern fulmars, her goal was to basically understand the release of these plastic-associated chemicals using an in vitro seabird stomach model. Because we don't know a lot about this plastic. We know that a lot of these birds have plastic, but we don't know then what happens to it once the plastic's inside the bird. And again, she's focusing on northern fulmars, who are basically, these are the poster child of plastic exposure for seabirds. Over 80% of them have been found to have plastic in their stomach. And she's looking at, for her seabird model, she's mimicking the ventriculus, which is basically kind of similar to like also called the gizzard for the northern fulmar. So you can think of the plastic, so she's looking at plastic and interested in chemicals from the actual plastic matrix itself, such as like a plastic water bottle, but also in the marine environment. What happens is when these plastics are floating around, they accumulate other persistent organic pollutants on top of them, such as PCBs. And so when that bird ingests the plastic piece, it's exposed to the chemicals of the matrix, but also the chemicals of the that had absorbed the surface, such as PCBs. And those could then go into the bird and cause harm. And again, the problem and worry is that these chemicals have been shown to bind to estrogen receptors, and then they can lower fertility and survival. So Lisbeth actually had pieces of plastic made for her study. She had 1%, a plastic piece made with 1% bisphenol S, like made into the plastic matrix. And then she soaked that in artificial seawater with PCBs to basically mimic this sort of adhering of the PCBs on the outside of the plastic. She had two phases of her in vitro model, stomach model. She used a flask, but she used a aqueous phase and also a lipid phase with marine oil. And every 20 hours, she would exchange the media to understand how much of the chemicals would kind of leach off the plastic in like these 20-hour intervals. And she did her study up to 100 hours. And she found that in both cases, bisphenol S, which is the matrix, because that's what she had built into the matrix, and PCB 138, which she had put in the artificial salt water that absorbed to the surface, came off the plastic into her artificial or her in vitro stomach model. Interestingly, she found for the bisphenol S, only about 3% of it came off within the 100 hours, compared to 100% of the PCB 138, which was on the outside, came off in 100 hours. So the bottom line is a lot came off in the first 2 days, but after 100 hours, then the bisphenol S just kept coming off. And if you think about these birds that have, especially northern fulmars, where over 80% have plastic in them pretty much like all the time, you can think about this plastic matrix. Her data suggests that it's continuously leaching these potentially toxic chemicals. And remember, I showed you BPS is very toxic. It activates the estrogen receptor and can really disrupt hormone function. So it can potentially leach for weeks, months, and then the bird might ingest more, and it just kind of keeps going. But the other question of this is that a lot of the work we had shown you, where we said that it's activating these estrogen receptors, those were done in humans. There's a ton of work showing that these chemicals can activate human estrogen receptors. And that's what I showed you earlier. That was a human estrogen receptor. But Lisbeth had a northern fulmar estrogen receptor synthesized. So she could basically see, well, what does it do to a northern fulmar? Because northern fulmars aren't humans. So is it bad for them too? And she found that, yes, it is bad for them. Here, the solid line is the human receptor response, and then the dotted line is the fulmar. And you could see here that there are slight differences, but by and large, the fulmar's estrogen receptors also activated by BPS, this toxic plastic-associated chemical. So Lisbeth is still working on this project. So if I come give you another talk in a year or so, maybe I'll have more information for you. But she's interested to basically understand then, she's going to extract pieces of plastic from northern fulmars and see whether or not they're activating the fulmar estrogen receptor to understand the biological. Okay, now I'm going to switch over to microplastics, little tiny pieces. Another graduate student, Sammy Mishishita, and she studied microplastic in the Monterey Bay ecosystem. She looked at microplastic in seawater, anchovies, and common murres that eat anchovies. And Sammy found from her study that 100% of her seawater samples had microplastic, 60% of her anchovies, and 100% of the murres. So there's a lot in there. Interestingly, and not that surprisingly, because other studies on microplastics in ocean or marine systems have found this, that the majority of particles that she found were fibers. And this is something that is of concern. And we think that the fibers could be coming off of clothing and then getting into the marine environment through wastewater treatment. And indeed, studies have shown that one wash of a synthetic clothing item can release greater than 1,900 fibers into wastewater. And there are things you can do. You can put like filters on your washing machine to try to catch these fibers. And other types of filters are actually the most effective. There's also these balls, but they're not as effective. But you can also think about trying to not purchase as much synthetic clothing, which is where the problem starts. So again, these fibers are getting into the ocean. getting into the seawater, getting into the anchovies, and getting into the common mers. But what's the, okay, back. So what's one of the things you have with these microplastic is that there's these tiny little pieces of fiber, and it's impossible by your naked eye to say, is that a piece of cotton or is that a piece of synthetic polyester? You can't tell by just looking at it. And so, Sammy, we used a spectroscopy to be able to definitively identify what the microparticles were, like what type of plastic they were. And of the identifiable particles, found that about 60% were indeed plastic-based. And so this is another part when you think about microplastic studies. First, it's hard to pick out these tiny little pieces. Second, you need to verify that they're plastic with some kind of spectroscopy work, because unlike the macroplastic where you can look at it and say, that's a plastic bottle cap. Again, you can't do that with this little plastic fragment or fiber. You can't tell, is that cotton or is that synthetic? You need to use spectroscopy. And then to me, one of the more alarming components of Sammy's work was she found that some of these tiny little pieces of plastic she found in the common mers had estrogenic activity and activated the estrogen receptor. This was a human estrogen receptor. And so that to me was alarming. Because if you think about 100% of the mers had these microplastic particles, and some of them had enough chemical leaching out of them after it had been in the bird to bind to an estrogen receptor and basically elicit a response. That to me is pretty scary. And I just wanted to do an interesting comparison here as I'm wrapping up the microplastic work. Again, we found 100% prevalence in the common mers. For macroplastic, prior studies found that about 5% of common mers had plastic. And I do not think it's because now all of a sudden a lot more mers have plastic. It's because we looked at microplastic. And I think that the more we look, the smaller amount, the more we're going to find. And this is illustrated by some of these studies here. As our detection methods improve and we can actually maybe look at nanoplastic particles, I think we're going to find plastic everywhere on our planet and everywhere in our bodies. We found them in blood, we found them deep in the lungs, and it's the reason that we haven't up to now is because we haven't had the ways to measure it. Now, more and more people are trying to figure out how to measure it, how to basically determine what it's made out of, and then we'll find it everywhere. The one thing we don't know, but I think we could sort of assume and wonder, is this microplastic in our blood and lungs also kind of releasing chemicals that can disrupt hormone function? I don't know, but it's something to think about. So I think it's pretty obvious how I feel about plastic, and I think we really need to think about turning off the tap. This is something that is commonly used, and I think it's a very important phrase. We just need to stop putting plastic into the environment. Trying to clean it up out of the ocean is not effective. We need to stop putting it in. There's some interesting replacements and things out there. I thought this was interesting, so I'm putting up, but there's all kinds of stuff. There's like compostable things and other kinds of plastic replacements. This is mushrooms to replace synthetic fibers. It's really interesting. It's pretty expensive, but it's interesting. Countries are doing things about this. The European Union, this is from 2021, is banning some single-use plastics. Single-use plastics are a huge problem. And again, with COVID, the use just skyrocketed again. And in the United States, we have more countries that have, more states that have bans on banning plastic bags than on states that actually ban plastic bags. Let's see if I said that right or well enough for you to understand. A couple of states basically have bans that make it so that their local governments are not able to do any bans on plastic bags. And so those are the states in yellow. Orange actually have statewide bans on plastic bags, like California is one of them. You can still get plastic bags, but there's restrictions on how. So we have a little ways to go here. What can you do? It's important. I know that you guys are probably very active voters, but thinking about voting for candidates that care about the environment and will create a circular economy. California has had some pretty amazing legislation come up in the last 5 years about different kinds of banning single-use plastics, promoting a circular economy. It hasn't passed, hasn't gotten the votes, but it's been introduced and there is hope. So I think that's something that we could try to strive for, this circular economy, where we're stopping to just use something, throw it out again and again. And with that, that's my plastic. So I'll take questions.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. If there are any questions, please put the questions into our Q&A section down at the bottom of your screen. It'll help us keep track of everything. And
so Myra, you talked about seabirds. What about terrestrial birds or land birds? Do they, they're not eating fish or in the seawater. Do they have the same kind of problems with microplastic in particular?
I'm sure they do. We haven't looked really. I mean, that's where it comes to where we look, we see it. I mean, I know condors eat plastic. They've had problems with plastic ingestion and plastic impaction. And I think, yeah, I mean, there's no reason why not. Measuring microplastic is challenging because you have to basically, digest the whole digestive tract and then sift through it and sort it to get these tiny little particles underneath the microscope. So it's a lot of work labor-wise, but I mean, it's in human feces, it's in human blood. I mean, yeah, I imagine that it would be kind of wherever we look, unfortunately.
Wow. So we have a few questions in the Q&A. So Thomas asks, how do we get rid of the microplastics in our body? And can we get rid of them?
yeah.
I don't know.
Sounds kind of gross, doesn't it?
I know. Frank, that thing you sent me, they said something about like having a well-ventilated room to make sure you didn't have stuff. There's certain things like not, being careful, don't drink water don't buy plastic bottled water. That has been shown to have plastic in it. So try to be careful about, I think once it's in your body, you kind of need to make peace with it. I mean, hopefully it won't be so bad, but trying to avoid getting more plastic in you. You should be careful about using plastic containers. Don't microwave in plastic containers. Don't use plastic containers that are old or crumbly. Don't use plastic bottled water. I mean, those kinds of things. But I think it's sort of one of those things that's kind of it's a now kind of a ubiquitous contaminant.
So you're talking about
it's a new contaminant, right? It's just really since World War II it's become. So now we're challenging the biosphere, not just birds, but humans and all other organisms to how to cope with this. And we're not, we have no evolutionary history in dealing with these kind of things. So
yeah.
Sorry, Ron.
No, that's fine. I think the upshot of what Myra's trying to say is all you can do really is reduce the amount of plastic that you are coming in contact with and ingesting, etc. Is that true?
I mean, maybe people will come up with ways to chelate it. I don't know of any. I don't know if people are doing that. I don't know if there's enough evidence of the actual harm it's causing to warrant that.
Right.
But if you think about, one of the main issues besides localized inflammation and irritation effects would be this kind of chemical releasing these hormone disrupting chemicals.
Right.
And if you think about trying to minimize your exposure to those chemicals in other areas, that would be a good thing as well. Just kind of, it's just all, don't eat large, big fish in the ocean because they've got a lot of that stuff in them. So I think it's kind of that trying to minimize your exposure in lots of ways. And it's kind of an additive.
Okay.
Okay, thank you. So Lily asks, which seabirds do you think are the most affected by this problem?
Such a good question. And, affected is a hard word. So in terms of like incidence of plastic ingestion, you could think about some of these procellariforms. They have a ton in storm petrels have so much plastic per weight. Like they have a ton also. But then if you want to say, so is it affected? Just have we found a lot in their bodies, or have we seen some negative impact from them? Because that we don't know. I mean, we don't have the information. So I don't know in terms of, types of seabirds that have high incidence of ingestion rates. I mean, I think like per body weight storm petrels are pretty high up there. But
well, great. We have a lot of young birders on the call as well as in lab. And for you young birders looking for something to research for your PhDs, this might be an interesting topic.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot there. I saw a question. It's actually, if you think about it, it can be sometimes worse for males because they get like feminization issues and have all kinds of reproductive issues. And there's evidence that people have found in seabirds, that like gross abnormalities when they've done, histology for seabirds for plastic, but the link has been still tenuous. And that's where I think Elizabeth was going to maybe look at that as well. But yeah, it is a big problem for males. Wow. And as these endocrine disruptors, cause infertility and reduce penis size of polar bears. I mean, all kinds of things. Not necessarily for polar bears plastic, but other endocrine disrupting chemicals.
Right.
So we have another question from Alex. Are there any tests that can measure levels of BPS, BPA in organisms?
Yeah, so I think that there are. I mean, you can measure it because we measure it in, like Elizabeth measured it in her solution. So you can measure it. I'm trying to think of I'm sure you can measure it in blood. And that might be one reason why we got BPA banned, is because we found evidence of BPA chemicals in humans. I don't think that and then we could also then measure for BPS. I think those studies are sort of currently going to the researchers are trying to keep up with the regrettable substitution of the industries. And it's like this thing. But I'm pausing a little because I'm trying to think, I don't know any wildlife studies where people have looked at this yet. Some of these chemicals are pretty expensive to analyze in tissues. And so that can be a barrier, unfortunately, to information, the cost of analysis. But you should look it up and see. I have to remember. I don't know.
In humans, it's rapidly excreted in the urine. And so you can detect it in the blood, but you can collect it integrated in a urine sample to see, because it's very rapidly excreted through the kidney. I don't know if it's the same in birds or not.
Might be, yeah. I don't know. As I'm trying to think, I don't know of any studies that have looked at it.
Okay, thank you. Thomas asks, are there any studies that are looking for substances that can bind to plastics in our bodies or bodies of birds, and then remove the plastic?
Yeah, again, not that I know of. So the lungs would be hard. So for the microplastic, the digestive tract, it kind of gets in, you can see, so that some of the studies have shown that it can kind of basically in the digestive tract get in there and cause inflammation and problems. So yeah, I don't know of any material. If it's a bigger piece, you could kind of do like, you know, try to give the animal something to regurgitate it or get it out. But for the smaller pieces, I'm just not sure what you do.
Yeah.
Okay. Another question someone asked is, what about enzymes that break down plastic? Is there any hope that this will become a solution in the future?
So people are working on this. You know, they're working on ways to break down plastic. And I think that there has been great advances in that. I'm personally hoping we switch to something that's not plastic instead of that.
Mushrooms.
There are, you know, microbes that can break down plastic and there is active research in that area. And so I am hopeful for that. I feel as a society, if we prioritize this as a problem, we would have fixed it by now, right? We can go to the moon, we can do all these things. It's just not been a priority for us to fix. So there are microbes people have been researching that can break down certain kinds of plastics and change them and do them, but it just hasn't gotten, I feel, the type of critical attention that I think is warranted for the global health crisis that it could be. But,
yeah, I think it's a lack of awareness. I think most people don't even realize that there's a problem.
Yeah, and I have plastic all over here. You know, it's impossible to avoid. And but yeah, so I guess to answer your question is, I know there's work on that. I know there are microbes that have shown that they can, you know, there's been progress in that way, but there's nothing that I know of that has been this huge, like, this is it. We're moving towards that.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Thomas asks, other than seeing a bird trapped in plastic or with plastic sticking out of its mouth, are there behavioral changes or other ways to tell when a bird has plastic poisoning?
So no, it's super hard. Like,
and
it's really hard. I know people that have tried to do studies where they're like using an ultrasound on the chick to try to determine how much plastic is in it and then say, does it fledge or does it not fledge? Like, how do we do this? How do we determine this? And it's really, there's no good way. I mean, there is limited evidence from some of the field studies that birds that have plastic are more likely to die. And that is done from like on Midway, when they used to allow cars, the chicks would get hit by cars all the time. And so they were more likely to find, like, birds that had plastic were more likely to not die from, like, just die, but not from an accident, like an accidental death. Does that make sense? So it seemed like the birds were more likely to die if they had plastic, because you had other birds that died being hit by cars that you could use as a control because they didn't have plastic. But it's really hard to answer that question. And we have very limited data, and there's no way to tell by looking or something like that.
But it's true, once we have that data, or once we're able to make that causation link, then we can turn it into show how it works in humans, and all of a sudden becomes an issue.
Yeah.
And so something might be done. Okay.
Yeah. And I almost showed it, but my colleague Chris, who wrote the paper about seabirds and pervasive, they have actually a modeling paper out that tried to quantify how, like, mortality rate of plastic ingestion, and found like balloons were one of the, the largest contributors to mortality. And that paper was cited for a city in Southern California, I think Laguna Niguel, who banned balloons. And so these kinds of studies, I mean, there's so few of them. And that one is a bit tenuous because it's a lot of modeling, which he's an amazing modeler. But it doesn't, it's a little bit like there aren't a ton of information, but even that can then push forward policy change, which is amazing.
Mm-hmm.
Yep, I agree. Well, that was a very, very interesting talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. It was really, really interesting. Lots of new information.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Excited about it. Yeah, thank you, Myra.
You're welcome. Well,
Yeah,
I hope you enjoyed it. I'm not quite as not as, it's a little different than my
It was a Semtex. I would have had him.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I hope you keep
really
us
like the
updated on
direction
anything
Semtex.
else that that could be done to help this problem.
Yeah.
Yeah,
getting
really.
legislators in that care. I think we need to do that, really.
I think I think you have the feeling that this may be a difficult talk to give. I think beginning each of your talks with bird jokes would probably go a long way to helping break the barrier down and all that. So keep that in mind,
Don't believe it, Myra.
I think the plastic parrot joke is going to have to be entered into my repertoire.
Yeah.
See, there we go.
Oh, no.
Well, again, thank you very, very much. We really appreciate it. And for everyone else, please tune in next month for our Raptor month, I think. And yeah, we're getting lots of thank yous.
Kind of like Shark Week and never.
Kind of like Shark Week, but
Raptor
Raptor month. Yes, yeah, exactly. Well, thank you again, Myra, and to everyone else, good night, and thank you for joining us. We'll see you next month. Take care.
Myra.
Thanks, Myra. Yeah.
Good night. Thank you.
Good night, everybody.
Good night, everyone.